Don't Eat Today's Special by username HelloHelloHelpHello. There is something terrifying going on in the restaurant downtown. Now, I could give you the address, I could tell you the exact location, I could even tell you turn-by-turn directions on how to get there. But I won't. I can't. I just can't. Instead, I'll describe how it looks, so you can turn away if you ever stumble on it by accident. But that's all I do, okay? I'd rather not have any of you try to find this place. Now, the restaurant I'm talking about is in the rundown part of my hometown. It's in the kind of neighbourhood that consists mainly of closed-up shops. You know the kind that I'm talking about, with their dusty windows blocked over with old newspapers and cardboard. However, there are only two kinds of businesses that seem to survive in this place. There are filthy bars lined with slot machines on one hand, and on the other are the kind of second-hand electronics shops that only seem to exist so that pickpockets can get rid of their stolen cell phones. But I digress. I used to take a shortcut through this district on my way home from my shitty little part-time job. Normally there was little to see, or rather what there was to see was either gross or concerning. Sometimes both. More times than not it was both. So what I usually do was not pay any attention in the first place. On this particular day, however, several months ago I do believe, an illuminated window caught my eye. All it was a simple tablecloth behind a dirty old window. It was the bright white colour that did the trick. Nothing really special, you may think, and, of course, you'd be right. But it was its clean condition that stood out in a place like this, where an all-encompassing aura of filth was an expected part of any decor. The window that I looked through belonged to a two-storey house, wedged in between some taller buildings. Graffiti obviously covered its walls to an extent that it rendered it barely recognisable as a restaurant. Once its name must have been painted on the wall above the window, with now only a few faded letters remained legible. D-A-I and then Stro was all I could make out. I guess the second used to be Bistro. No idea about the first one though. Upon taking a second look through the illuminated window, I spotted a laid table housing a single lone customer. There are other tables and chairs haphazardly littered around the room, but this central one was the only table sporting a bright white tablecloth and a guest. Various pots and pans were strewn about on its surface. The air above was filled with the soft, foggy steam of freshly cooked food. There was a lot of it. Far too much for the lone patron. He was a skinny man with worn clothes that seemed far too big for him. His cheeks looked hollow and his arms spindly. Maybe, just maybe, part of the local population of homeless, drifters and addicts. Definitely not the kind of person who might be able to afford a meal of this size. The strangest thing was that he was facing my direction without looking directly at me or the window in general. His attention was completely focused on the food. He shoveled a spoon filled with mashed potatoes and green beans into his mouth before grasping the nearby glass of water to flood the generous portion down his throat. There was an obvious appetite in the way he hungrily wolfed down anything he could get his hands on, and the longer I stared at the simple but generous meal, the more I started to grow hungry myself. For a minute or two I fruitlessly walked back and forth in front of the place, searching for any way to enter. The only visible door though was closed, and it didn't look like it was an entrance in the first place. It was a plain steel door sporting an electric warning sign. After returning to the window one last time, I gave up. I went home and proceeded to forget about the whole encounter. I didn't think about it again until I passed by the same fucking window again the week after. As soon as I caught a glimpse of the white colour, the memory came flooding back. The very same man was there though. Or, more likely, he was there again, and once more he sat there in front of a lavish meal. A sweaty gleam was covering his face, and I swear I could see the muscles in his neck tense and twitch whenever he swallowed. The only thing that had really changed from the week before was the food. The simple mix of potatoes, soups and steamed vegetables had been replaced by more intricate and expensive meals. Plates housed nicely arranged cutlets of various meats, each drenched in a different sauce and adorned with a few herbs. With a twist of his wrist, the patron scooped up the serving of thin, delicate noodles, dripping with olive oil and roasted garlic. He squeezed the fork against his lips, his jaw still trying to chew the previous load. Then he opened his mouth and shoved in the noodles, nearly choking in the process. Thinking back on this, he did look slightly distressed as he tried to swallow the portion while his hands were already scooping up the next load. A tender piece of chicken breast from its roast dipped in a brown marinade. He slightly shuddered as he forced the food down. He took a second to sip on a glass of red wine, then went back to stuffing himself. I watched him for 5 minutes before moving on. Admittedly, the scent drifting through the window was enticing, but I had already given up on the notion of finding an entrance to the building. When I came home, I emptied my fridge and cooked myself a giant meal as well. The next time I came back to the restaurant wasn't by chance. Something about the whole place had piqued my interest, and I was looking forward to seeing whether or not the same singular customer had returned for a third time. To my disappointment, something was blocking the view that particular night. A board of some sort was propped against the window from the inside. I could still see parts of the room through a small gap, and I could see that the light was still burning, and that somebody appeared to be still sitting in the place the man had been in the last 2 weeks. But there was no way I was getting a good look at what was going on. With my curiosity left unsatisfied, I went home. The next day, I made a detour to return. I just hated to be left hanging like that. The window was blocked again. Now, I admit that over the next few weeks, I'd developed a habit of dropping by the place every now and then. Sometimes the window was blocked, sometimes I got a good view into the room. Whenever I did, I found the same sight. The same skinny man sitting in front of the increasingly luscious meals, gorging himself on the food. Though, by now, you couldn't really call him skinny anymore, though. He had gained at least a little bit of weight. His cheeks were no longer sunken in, and his formerly loosely hanging vest had grown a bit tighter around his waist. While he had eaten with a healthy appetite at first, his expression had now turned slightly pained by now. Every bite had become a struggle. Every motion seemed forced. His nose wrinkled in disgust every time his lips opened. Still, he kept eating. I also have to admit that I didn't pay all that much attention to him anymore. I paid more attention to the increasingly exotic food. That was just too bizarre to look away from. Every time I was allowed just the tiniest glimpse at the table, I'd seen more and more alien items appearing in more and more strange arrangements. Jelly cubes encasing sharp fanged anglerfish, misshapen eggs the size of my fist emitting a faint glow, noodles that were so thin and dark they looked like hair. It became hard to even recognise half the stuff as edible in the first place. I watched this man crack open the gigantic body of a purple spider crab, watched him bite down on moss-covered mushrooms that spat out clouds of yellow spores with every touch, witnessed him sitting in front of a plate of little squirming black bugs that tried to flee from his spoon as he shoveled them into his maw, giant algae plants shaped and twisted round each other like strands of DNA, needle-covered orange balls that slightly shivered as if breathing, the roasted body of some 8-legged animal. Now, I can't tell if it's the remembrance of some freak of nature or several animals stitched together to create a new abnormal shape. Soon, I ignored what the patron completely, and I just dropped by to see what kind of absurd and horrific ideas the cook had to come up with at this time. And strangely, no matter how bizarre or how abhorrent the food looked, it left me wanting to try it myself. It left me hungry and searching for something to fill myself up with as well. And then, when I finally returned home to plunder my kitchen, I ended up unsatisfied. And strangely, no matter how bizarre or how abhorrent the food looked, it left me wanting to try it myself. It left me hungry and searching for something to fill myself up with as well. And then, when I finally returned home to plunder my kitchen, I ended up unsatisfied. Before the day in question, I hadn't gotten a clear view into the restaurant for a month. Just little hints here and there, but never enough to leave me satisfied. And on that day, finally, the window was free again. The fucking moment I stepped closer, this joyful, idiotic excitement I felt turned into a subtle horror. There was only one single item laying on the table. It looked like the carcass of a large stag at the first glance, a 4-legged animal with short reddish-brown fur and huge dark antlers. At the second glance, the alterations that had been done to the creature were unmistakable. Now, I say alterations because I refuse to believe that a thing like this could have come out of any natural process. I mean, it must have been crafted artificially, maybe taxidermied out of a different animal, or animals. If so, then the creator of this monstrosity did a perfect job of blending the various parts into one seamless whole. Instead of hooves, the stag was sporting 4 hands, like those of an ape or some similar primate. Wrinkled and calloused, but hands nevertheless. Its face too was not that of a deer. The nose was flat and thin. The mouth large and adorned with human-like lips. Its skin around these parts hairless and flesh-coloured. A large hole had been torn into its side. Broken ribs were sticking out. Blackish blood darkened the fur around the open wound. The poor man, was leaning over the carcass. His mouth stained with the dark red colour of blood as well. Some entrails were hanging between him and the corpse, and with an unhuman motion of his head, he slurped them down as if they were spaghetti. He had changed completely, the man. His formerly lithe body was now encompassed by layers of fat. His eyes had turned into beady black holes, almost as if they had retreated completely into his skull. His clothes, now ill-fitting in completely different ways, had burst in several different places, revealing the hairless, greasy, pale skin underneath. He looked less like a man and more like a giant overgrown maggot. The way his neck had swollen to the size of his shoulders, the way his arms barely peeked out of the armour of his fat surrounding him. And then he looked up. He looked away from the meal for the first time and straight at me. There was nothing but a deep and bottomless hunger. Saliva gathered in the corner of his mouth. His gaze wandered up and down my body. He licked his lips. I did the only thing I could do. I turned and left. It took some force not to run, but I managed to keep walking at a slow and steady pace. Maybe running would have been a better response, to being looked at like that. But at that moment, I was still trying to hold on to reason, trying to find some logical explanation, was trying to laugh all of this off. Maybe I was just confused. Maybe this was a completely different customer. Surely the blind hunger in his eyes wasn't actually targeted at me. But nothing could quench the growing unease and fear in the back of my mind. I didn't want to go back. Didn't want to be forced to look at this creature ever again. But I had to. I had to make sure the man was still there, locked in the room, one last time. When I returned today, my worst nightmare had already come true. The man was now gone. The table was empty. The metal door with the electrical warning stood open, leading into the room, and an enticing smell floated through the air towards me. Despite all I had witnessed, I found myself taking a step towards the opening. Before I could take another, something heavy moved in the nearby alley. Some street cat let out a startled scream that was cut short. A moment later, there was sounds of crackling and munching from the building. This time, I did run. I did the only thing I could do. I turned and left. It took some force not to run, but I managed to keep walking at a slow and steady pace. Maybe running would have been a better response to being looked at like that. But at that moment, I was still trying to hold on to reason, trying to find some logical explanation, was trying to laugh all of this off. Maybe I was just confused. Maybe this was a completely different customer. Surely the blind hunger in his eyes wasn't actually targeted at me. But nothing could quench the growing unease and fear in the back of my mind. I didn't want to go back. Didn't want to be forced to look at this creature ever again. But I had to. I had to make sure the man was still there, locked in the room, one last time. When I returned today, my worst nightmare had already come true. The man was now gone. The table was empty. The metal door with the electrical warning stood open, leading into the room, and an enticing smell floated through the air towards me. Despite all I had witnessed, I found myself taking a step towards the opening. Before I could take another, something heavy moved in the nearby alley. Some street cat let out a startled scream that was cut short. A moment later, there was sounds of crackling and munching from the building. This time, I did run. I will not return to this place ever again. I will not return to this part of the city ever again. I'm even making plans to move far away. The scent that drifted out of the open door is still stuck in my nose, and no food I touch can satisfy my growing appetite. And there is one more detail about tonight that keeps popping back into my mind. Right next to the open door, somebody had propped up a simple blackboard. It read, "Today's special, all you can eat."